Hey everyone, this is Liam McCullum again, and today I'll have Mark Schneider on to talk about Gen 4 nuclear reactors. He is the president of Gen 4 Nuclear Inc., and he considers himself a nuclear futurist. He has presented his green nuclear deal to both Republicans and Democrats because he thinks that it's more likely to fight climate change, and he believes that both Republicans and Democrats think this too. So, we'll be talking about that. And basically, before we get started, I just wanted to say that with the future of this podcast, I really just want to bring on different perspectives that a lot of people don't hear about. My first podcast was about just an anti-war position with Scott Horton. He went through all the history of the Iraq War and basically where we're at with Iran right now. And then my second podcast was with Mike Meharry, a friend of mine, and we talked about constitutionalism, states' rights, libertarianism, God, and gold. So really, I'm all over the place with this, but if you want to just let me know if there's any other topics you'd like me to cover. I kind of want to start talking about Montanan issues, more local stuff. So just let me know what you think of this, and if you make it all the way to the end, thank you, and come back soon.
Hey, Liam.
Hey Mark, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. Today I just kind of wanted first I wanted to go over your background a little bit.
Okay.
Maybe just could you tell us who you are, where you come from, what you do?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's hear. I grew up in Oregon. Graduated high school. I went and joined the Navy. I did 20 years operating nuclear reactors. I did both submarines and aircraft carriers. Then I did some regulatory oversight as well. The Navy does its own self-regulation, and so I got to do some of that. And then I retired from the Navy, and then I started working in a commercial power plant. And then using all that experience, I've been able to coordinate and work with, figuring out how these new generation reactors work. I'm a man of very few interests, so I say this pretty much all the time. My wife is a nuclear engineer as well, so we have the nerdiest pillow talk. And she actually has a master's degree in basically Generation 4 reactors. So most of my information actually comes from her. She's taught me, and I'm more the face of it. She likes to be more behind the scenes. So so she pushes a lot of this stuff as well. Like, lets me be the face of it, but really she's the brains behind the operation and the looks.
Well, that's good to hear. So you specifically talk about Generation 4 reactors. Then that's what you said.
Yeah, that's what I talk about. All fission nuclear for the most part.
Okay.
But Generation 4 is kind of the stuff I'm pushing for the most.
Okay, cool. So I kind of wanted to just preface the rest of the interview with some information I found about because I live in Montana, so just
Okay.
the regulations within Montana itself. So as of now, I know that the state has jurisdiction over X-ray equipment, naturally occurring radioactive materials, and certain materials not produced in a reactor. And also, nuclear reactors are dependent on voter approval. So basically, in order for things to get financed or a nuclear reactor to be built, it has to be voted upon.
Okay.
So it is highly dependent on the state, and I do know that Montana also is very dependent on fossil fuels. We love coal, but could you kind of just make the case for nuclear energy and why it's safe? I tend to agree with you on this topic, but I know that a lot of Montanans might not.
Yeah, so nuclear energy is, you actually do the breakdown by there's a couple of great graphics, and I'll send them to you. They do the breakdown by death per terawatt hour, and nuclear is either at the lowest or at the second lowest, depending on which group of statistics you're looking at. You have to look at it from a scale, right? Nuclear power plants are extremely large. So there's very few of them. So when you have an accident, it's a big deal, right? Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island. But when you actually look at it, Fukushima destroyed 3 nuclear reactors and killed 0 people, right? So that's what a lot of people don't realize is that, yes, we've had some major accidents with them, but, outside of Chernobyl, it's basically, we've had no deaths associated with commercial nuclear reactors from a nuclear accident. Now there are some, the standard falls and stuff like that, but even then the industry over-regulates itself with all that stuff. I'll do a comparison. In the U.S., you look at it, we've had one major accident, that was 3 Mile Island from a commercial reactor. And then, so one major accident. And then if you look at like the natural gas industry, in April of 2019, down in North Carolina, they had an operator screw up, caused an explosion, killed the operator who did it, killed himself and 2 other people, and we don't bat an eye.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of that big, discussion. One of the other things when you talk about safety is let's talk about pollution control. So the fossil industry basically takes their waste, right? Their waste just gets emitted into the atmosphere. So it gets spread all over the state. All over the state of Montana is being covered by basically coal ash, by CO2 from natural gas, any of the pollution associated with oil, right? Mm-hmm. So that's just being spread all over the state. With nuclear power, they don't produce CO2. They don't produce any emissions. Well, I'll rephrase that. There are some minor amounts, but it's extremely, extremely small when you look at the overall power. And then what happens is that the waste that's left over is stored in containers on the site, and it doesn't cause any harm. It's a solid inside of a container.
Right.
So, and that's just using the old nuclear. And that's, old nuclear is, which is what all the stat is based off, is the safest form of energy. And then when you get into the advanced generation 3 reactors, like the NuScale power module or the BWXRT, or the BWXRT, I believe that's, but I might get the names wrong here. Those are advanced generation 3 reactors where the NuScale power module basically can't melt down, and then the GE Hitachi BWX300, that's what it is. It actually, you have 7 days of basically what's called passive cooling before you have to actively stop it from melting down, right? In a week, we could be around the country, 1,000 times bringing in equipment to make it not melt down, right? Whereas if you look at an old reactor, which still, again, the safest, we have hours to basically start getting our cooling systems in place. Now we have a week, right? So think about, if you look at it from that perspective. And then when you're getting into Generation 4 reactors, one, to be labeled a Generation 4 reactor, it has to be safe for meltdown. So meaning that if it were to undergo a Fukushima level loss of cooling systems, it would not be able to melt down. And then the other thing is that some of them, not all of them, but some of them can actually consume nuclear waste as their fuel. So if you look at a site, say, down in Arizona at Palo Verde, they've got, 3 reactors, largest power station in the United States, and, they've got 40 years of fuel out there of this inefficient design. Well, I could use that as fuel in a new reactor, and then what's left over is a waste. Instead of lasting 100,000 years, lasts, say, 300 years.
Right.
And then even then, we can break that down into smaller components, and then, instead of having, a ton of waste, I really only have about, or 100 tons of waste. I've only about 1 or 2 that actually have to manage for that long time period.
Right. And then I think a lot of people do focus on Chernobyl specifically. The series came out just a little bit ago and stuff like that. And when I had heard you speak this summer, you contrasted like the technology in Generation 4 with the technology that they had back then, and you kind of use the examples of like the submarines and how the computer systems are able to detect. Could you kind of go into that technology?
Yeah. So when you talk about Chernobyl, so Chernobyl was a flawed design with a lack of safety equipment compounded, right? So if I were to take so there's, first off, United States reactors cannot undergo a Chernobyl level event. It's physically impossible. The physics don't work to make that happen. As far as our commercial reactors,
is that because of the technology, or like what?
It's core construction and geometry. It's just the way that they're designed. They have what it is that the way our reactors design is that if temperature rises in them, it provides a negative power, which is going to drive the power of the reactor down. So it basically starts to shut itself down.
Okay.
So it's called a negative feedback loop. Well, in Chernobyl, they had a positive feedback loop, meaning that When temperature rose, it caused power to rise. When power rises, it causes temperature to rise, which then causes, right? You see that it attempts to approach infinity, and then you actually have an overpower casualty, which flashed all the water to steam.
Right.
So if we were to magically, say, transform a reactor in the United States to a Chernobyl-style reactor and did that exact same test, and it exploded, we have a containment structure that would contain that. So the all that material and all that caused that huge exclusion area out in Ukraine wouldn't have occurred because it had been contained inside the containment. You see this big, thick concrete. They're like a dome on top and a cylinder on the bottom, or sometimes they're just cylinders. So they're designed to take that. They're concrete reinforced structures with the steel inner lining. And I mean, the concrete, the rebar is like this big around. They're 6 inches in diameter, the rebars. So it's not, this isn't the rebar you buy at Home Depot. And this, by the way, and right now we're comparing 1960s technology here. We're not even into the future stuff, right? So first off, our reactors can't undergo that because they're not Chernobyl designs. And then B, the fact is that we have safety equipment in place. Now, when you're talking about Generation 4 reactors, we actually put 3 early model reactors that would be similar to a Generation 4 today through Chernobyl level events. You probably have never heard of them. They're all test reactors, mind you. But overpower casualties is what happened in Chernobyl. They had too much power come out of the reactor. And all the 3 reactors I can speak to were all metal-cooled reactors. So there was experimental breeder reactor 1 out in Idaho. There was the reactor out in San Susanna. And then there was Fermi Unit 1. And what happened is that they overpowered it, but because instead of using water, they used a molten liquid sodium, so it's a metal, so it can handle that heat, right? So it got hot enough and it melted the reactors down, but they were able to extract those reactors and they put new reactors in and ran them again. So, and this is early on, so we hadn't developed the ability to control the reaction real well. So now we have computer systems and even before that, going back to the 1960s technology, we had automatic protective systems that basically you have multiple channels to ensure that, if one fails, you've got backups. You have backups, and then, just to make sure you have lots. You have lots and lots of backups. I mean, I'm talking 4 channels for everything, so that you can even have 2 fail and you'll still provide the protection, even though you're only allowed to have 1 out of service. Because you assume that 1 has failed and you don't know.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's going back into the old. Now we get into the new. So we take what we've learned in the past, and we apply it with these new reactors. We have computer modeling, which didn't exist when they built Chernobyl or the reactors in the United States. And when we talk about computer modeling, the United States Navy has, and I like pointing back here because that's one of those submarines, Virginia-class submarine, that were on like the 24th to 25th being built. And now, granted, that's like an advanced Generation 3 reactor. They run it through a computer model, and that model is so accurate that when they do what's called the district criticality, they withdraw the control rods to bring the reactor online for the first time. They are exact. They've been within 0.1 inches of the expected rod height every single time, and the error is probably due to the fact that a human being has to declare that the reactor has gone critical. So a guy like me who's an operator has to go, I have the following indications. I declare the reactor critical. We had a computer system set, and there is a computer system set up, but by regulation, we're not allowed to rely on the computer. We have to rely on the human being to make that call. If you want to look at the computer, I bet you it's accurate within 0.01 inches, not 0.1, right? It's probably a factor of 10 difference.
So current regulation right now restricts, it doesn't allow computer systems.
For some aspects, yes.
Okay.
So,
cool.
I mean, and to give you an idea, when I first started in the industry, it was basically everything was analog, meaning you have to get like old FM radio style. And I've seen, drastic changes towards, and the Navy was Type 1 microprocessor, which is, think of like the 1980s Atari level technology. And then now we're on to flat screens, it looks like, advanced computer systems and the Type 2 instrumentation controls, what INC stands for. And now we're seeing that being developed into the commercial industry. I mean, if you go out to a reactor right now, it's literally a bunch of old knobs and dials. I mean, it looks really archaic, but it's effective. We know it works really well. But with these computer systems, they're getting more and more advanced. They're getting better and better. And I mean, and it's absolutely phenomenal the way they operate reactors. Like we used to have to, as an operator, I used to have to memorize all these set points based on that. I have one pump running in one of my loops and two in the other, and I have this switch in this position. I had to know I had to memorize exactly what my limit of the reactor output was. Now it's a computer model that it's fluid, meaning that it changes as the different parameters throughout it change. So we're much better at this technology.
Right.
I mean, you look at it, you go pre-computer, post-computer, and we run through these models over and over and over and over again, so we know we can make it happen. And even our old design reactors, we understand how the fuel is loaded into the core, and we basically take every reactor apart every 18 months. A third of it gets sent out as waste. We bring a third in new fuel, reassemble it, and they run a model over it. And they know exactly when the reactor is going to be, brought online. So we have able to use computers with old technology to prove it over and over again. And when you look at that, one of the huge benefits of these computer modeling is that over the lifespan of nuclear, we've actually been able to uprate the reactors, meaning that an 800 megawatt reactor is now probably more like 850 or 900 megawatts, right? Say, a 10 to 12% increase in power output. Mm-hmm. So it's able to, using the exact same footprint, we haven't changed anything on the reactor other than to do the modeling and say, listen, we're actually safer than we thought we were. So we can, bring up a little bit more power.
Right. Yeah. So I think last time I talked to you, it was, there was a specific, I don't know if it was a statistic or something like that, but it was specifically when you looked at the computer systems and their ability to detect certain faults within like submarines, like the amount of time I think it took. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting, and it's called time response testing, and that means that if you have the indication occurs that would cause an automatic protective feature of the reactor. So literally you time it from the time it takes from that let's say it's a temperature indication. So I'm going to arbitrarily pick something. It's a temperature indication that goes too high, which is going to tell the reactor it's got to take an action, right? So we measure the time it takes for that temperature indication to be, sensed to the circuitry. And then we basically measure each point through the circuitry all the way down to, let's say, it causes the control rods to drop. That whole time frame is measured. And we're talking from the moment that the temperature indication occurs till those rods are all the way on the bottom, shutting down the reaction, is literally 1 to 2 seconds. And we measure these things. They're measured in milliseconds. And the longest part is actually causing that rod to drop. Right? So that's the longest part. So when I'm saying 1 to 2 seconds, basically 0.9 to 1.5 seconds is the rod physically dropping. And as it's dropping, the reaction is shutting down the whole way. Okay. So really, once the action of that rod beginning to drop occurs, that's when the reactor's really starting to shut down.
Okay. So I saw on your Twitter account you speak about what you call the hashtag green nuclear deal. Can you kind of, I mean, this gets more into politics, but can we talk about your position just on, I guess, the Green New Deal that was proposed and basically where we stand within, I know that you say Donald Trump has been pretty good on nuclear energy, so can you kind of speak on that?
So, all right, the Green Nuclear Deal, I literally saw the Green New Deal and I said, hey, I can do better than this with the Green Nuclear Deal. So basically, when I look at the argument about climate change, the big concern of climate change is carbon emissions coming from electricity. We could talk about the other stuff as it goes, and because there are other aspects to that. And industries are coming to me to talk to me about how to fix some of those other things as well. But really, the big thing I said is we've got to get our electricity production first. Because if we take and we get our electricity production, we decarbonize that, assuming climate change is real, then we can, fix that aspect. So there's the first, and I take a two-position stance with climate change. Climate change is either a real problem that we have to take drastic action to correct, and nuclear energy is the best solution to do that, or it's a giant mass hysteria, and we have to take drastic action to to stop the people that are going to destroy our economy and our planet ecosystems, installing wind and solar, and nuclear is a solution for that as well. So it's two problems, one's left, one's right, and they converge at nuclear power. So that's kind of where my big thing comes from. And when I talk about the green nuclear deal, I talk about it in three phases. And I've kind of given a more adult description to it. I call it the National Nuclear Power Strategy, so NNPS. And phase one is that these are using existing licensed reactor designs, and it's specifically, I say the AP1000, which is the reactors are being built in Vogtle, and we build, it's like 80 of these things all over the nation in sites that have been previously licensed for reactors, had reactors under construction. There are 7 previous generation that we need to build, but basically there's enough sites where there's extra units we could place at existing sites that were designated to build reactors, and we build these things. Overall price tag on that's huge. It's about $800 billion. I say about, like I said, about 100 billion of it, or sorry, no, about 50 billion of it in direct subsidies. Get building going, right? Because we don't have a lot of experience building because we had a 30-year break.
What the 30-year break was that? What
the 30-year break in nuclear construction.
Okay.
So yeah, so we stopped building in the 80s, and then we started building Vogtle in 2013.
Okay.
So there's a long break right there. There's a couple of reactors that are some one-offs that were finished in one in 91 and 2016, but they were started in the 70s. So we have this long break in construction. So we need to get that back up there, get the base up. And by picking one design, the AP1000, which was basically selected by a defunct company called SCANA and Southern Nuclear. SCANA was building 2 at BC Summer in South Carolina, and then Vogtle units 3 and 4. So I said that's our fleet design for large-scale Generation 3 reactors. So that's the first thing, and we know we can do this. They're licensed. We have several licensed to be built right now. But we could build 80 of these things and basically double our nuclear output, which would reduce the carbon emissions in the United States by about 1/4, right? So, and knowing we could do that, we could just start getting those built. And then in the meantime, we've got 2 companies. And I mentioned it before, we've got GE Hitachi has the BWX T300, which is a 300 megawatt reactor, but it's going to be built in the factory. And then you have NuScale, which is a 60 megawatt unit, or the Vogtle units are 11, or the AP1000 are about 1,100 megawatts each. So these are going to be able to be factory built. Now, NuScale, you can purchase their units in a single, so one little 60 megawatt could be installed, say, small town in Montana, right, or Wyoming, right. So these are don't need a large. You're not looking for large amount of power, or you can buy them at up to 12. Right, so now you got a 620 megawatt unit with 12 reactors in it. And I said, hey, let's give each of these companies $10 billion. So we went from almost close to $1 trillion, almost it's like 800, 900 billion, down to 20. Give these companies $10 billion to get their factories built, get their first units online, and we'll do it as most of the stuff I proposed as loans, so not a direct subsidy, but just do it as a loan. Get these things building, and then when they start, installing them, they'll see more and more. And it's going to be about 10 years before they're able to actually start really having a large-scale production.
Okay.
And at that meantime, right, that phase one is really taken off, and you've got a bunch of reactors going online. And I said build about 100 gigawatts worth, which is about 10% or about 20% of our power. So now I've decarbonized our electricity production by a total of 50% of the carbon emissions, and now 60% of the nation is nuclear. And then phase 3, which is going to take about 20 years to get up and running, is similar process with phase 2, but instead of using these advanced Gen 3 small modular reactors, using Generation 4. I said, we need a national competition. We're going to pick 3 designs as a nation. They're going to compete. So there's like a dozen or so, or there's actually more than that. It's almost like 20 or 30 companies that have different Generation 4 designs, have them compete, the different phase competition, competition, and then, the best one wins. And some of these Generation 4 reactors are as small as 1.5 megawatts, which, I mean, that's really small. I mean, it's a great for, small towns in Alaska way up north, or, mining facilities. Or I have a cousin who's big in the cannabis industry, and they want to get into nuclear because they're running their stuff off of their own natural gas plants, but they'd rather have, like say a 5 megawatt nuclear reactor they could just run all their grow lights off of, and all their cooling systems and auxiliary systems. So seeing all that, all that change, and they're about 10-year shots for each of these, and a lot of it's getting through that licensing, changing the regulations. Because when you look at Generation 4, we've got two big hurdles that are in the way. One is that most of these Generation 4 designs fall under what are called fast reactors, meaning that they use a high energy neutron as opposed to a thermal or low energy neutron, which is what we use right now. It allows us to use the 95% of the fuel we don't consume in our current reactors. We can consume that. So that's the first regulation. And then the other is actually spent fuel reprocessing, so that I can take that spent nuclear material and I can actually reprocess it to put into these reactors.
So
there's two things.
Okay, so those are current restrictions, like you're not allowed to do that right now because of regulation,
that's right.
or okay.
So that is the current struggle that we're having, is those are the two big regulations that I know of. There's some other regulations out there, or lack of regulations. So right now it's called the ASME code, which is, I don't remember what ASME stands for. Don't quiz me on that. But it's basically for inspection of pressure vessels. So whether it's a boiler at a coal plant, or the steam generator, or a reactor vessel at a nuclear power plant. Right now, the current U.S. codes only cover light water, or for nuclear, light water reactor vessels and liquid metal reactors. We can't do a heavy water reactor, which is like what the CANDU design in Canada has. We can't do molten salt. We can't do gas temperature cooled. So it's the way that the regulations have really kind of bound, or lack of regulation kind of bound us just from one aspect. So there's a lot of things that have to get put into place to make this work. It's not as simple as, hey, I just want to build one of these things. Although there is a company called Thorcon that is saying, hey, I just want to build some of these things, so U.S. doesn't want to let me do it. Indonesia says, okay, yeah, we'll take our design to Indonesia, right? We'll pick up our toys and run.
Right.
So
what's the thought process behind those current regulations, the two that you were talking about?
So Jimmy Carter was president of the United States when those went into effect, and the concern was with nuclear weapons proliferation. And it comes from a gross conceptual error on the part of the Carter administration. And I think they were really concerned about, this is in the middle of the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union are rapidly building nuclear weapons. U.S. has enough, weapons to basically kill every Russian like 100 times. They have enough to kill us, every American if they were cats. So everyone is really concerned about nuclear weapons. So they wanted to make a big statement. And when you're talking about fast reactors, really their fuel is plutonium. Plutonium, people think weapons. But if you operate a reactor off of plutonium, that plutonium actually can't be turned into a bomb at all. Well, it could, but it'd be so complex, it'd be actually easier to create plutonium freshly outside of that reactor in a different type of reactor. There's special physics involved where it's easier to design a reactor to make bomb plutonium than to just use plutonium that you pull out of a reactor.
Okay.
Right. There's a specific isotopes. It's not weapons grade, and to turn non-weapons grade plutonium into weapons grade plutonium is expensive and extremely dangerous. You're basically going to kill a bunch of workers doing it. Yeah. When I could just go build a special reactor that makes the plutonium the way I want it, and then just chemically extract it, as opposed to having to chemically extract it from the uranium and then centrifuge it, which means you have to turn it into a gas. People breathe that in, and then it's going to kill them. That's honestly, and you hear people talk about nuclear waste, the big concerns about it. It's actually, when we're talking nuclear waste, we're talking about plutonium is the big thing that everyone's concerned about. Inhaling that stuff's really bad. It gets in your lungs, stays in there. It is going to bombard your lungs with, really powerful radiation.
Yeah.
But it's only affects you inside your body. It's called an alpha radiation. Like you could literally stand. You and I could walk, or any human could walk up to the most, purest plutonium ever, and it wouldn't hurt them. You could touch it because literally the radiation gets stopped by the dead layer of skin on the outside of your body. So it won't even penetrate into the living skin, just the dead skin, right? So that's how. But put it inside yourself, right? That's not a good thing.
Yeah.
So by breathing it in real bad, that's why you would never you wouldn't want to do this. I was going somewhere, I completely forgot.
I was just talking about
the regulations.
The regulations, right? Yeah. So but yeah, I'm super interested in the competition aspect of it, like you were saying. I know that this summer when we were talking, you said something about like you were more concerned with equal treatment. So like with the fossil fuel industry, obviously they have an easier path. Do you believe that, I guess, if we got rid of subsidies on fossil fuels, I guess nuclear would come up on top?
Yeah, so the fossil fuel industry receives $21 billion a year annually from the United States government in direct subsidies, right? The renewables receive $7 billion. As far as I know, the United States government does not direct subsidize any nuclear. They state subsidize. They will subsidize states based on their carbon emissions, but there's no direct subsidies of nuclear. The only quote unquote subsidy for nuclear is Vogtle has a federal loan, right? So Vogtle for their construction has a federal loan. All subsidies from the federal government for nuclear are either a loan or nothing.
Yeah.
Now there is some money in the latest budget for lab construction, for stuff out at laboratories, for the DOE to start this competition, saying, I think it's 260 million, not billion, but million, to start doing, getting some of these Gen 4 companies and get their design. So basically Rita Barnali, I think, she's the head of the Office of Nuclear Energy. She basically has a blank check for 260 million, right, to whomever you want to build advanced reactor designs. So, and that's cool, right? Because it allows us to say, hey, we're going to look at these different companies, and the government is going to be overly involved in this. And I'm not saying they shouldn't be involved, but that is great because it does produce a lot of competition, right? We do want some competition, but the government's going to be involved because it is, I don't want the industry going out and doing whatever, because I may not be able to install 10 giant 1,000-megawatt reactors in this small little pond because it's going to boil all that water dry, right? That's not good for the environment. So we have to do, there's called environmental impact statements. Every power plant has that. As far as talking about the equal treatment between us and the fossil industry, it's not just the subsidies aspect. If you want to give equal treatment, absolutely. Every time a coal plant has to shut down because an operator makes an error, put it in the news. Every time they have, a spill at one of their locations, put it in the news. And make it a headline, right? Because I go through. If I Google nuclear and I look at the articles 2 or 3 times a week, I'm going to see an article about there was a problem at this plant in Russia, and they shut the reactor down to make sure that they were okay and that it was not an issue. They fixed it and brought the reactor back online. That's not news. That's called safe operation, right? But because of a nuclear reactor shut down, the world is ending, right? That's the way that the news sells you fear. But we literally shut down fossil plants all the time for faults. They start those. We literally had at nuclear sites, you typically have a few little gas-fired plants for super peak loads in the summer and in the extreme heat of the summer and the extreme cold of the winter. Literally one of the ones on the site, like they fired the thing up. We thought we had a fire in our switchyard because they didn't operate the thing right. I'm dressed out in fire protection gear, ready to go out and fight the fire out of the switchyard.
Yeah.
It turns out they just didn't know what they were doing and were basically billowing a bunch of smoke out they didn't need to. Oh wait, they were just doing excessive pollution because they didn't operate correctly. If that happened in a nuclear power station, they would have shut all production work down. We'd have spent 24 hours talking about how our standards have slipped. We need to correct it. We need to get back on track. This is a big deal. They probably would have fired someone over it. Like, just, they didn't kill anyone. They didn't hurt anyone. They just operated their equipment improperly.
Mm-hmm.
We operate our equipment properly, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
So, that's what I'm talking about by equal footing. And if you actually regulated the fossil companies the way that you regulate nuclear, just from an oversight perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have a resident engineer plus an assistant from the NRC that is at our site. They can walk in anywhere, they have access anywhere, they can ask questions, make comments, the whole 9 yards. If you did that at a fossil plant, they'd be shut down all the time because, you have coal ash where it's not supposed to be. You need to fix that. Things like that. So that's just, we allow the fossil industry and the wind and solar, let's not forget about them. We allow basically anything that's not nuclear, they basically have to self-report, and they get the occasional spot check to make sure that they're self-reporting. Mm. Nuclear, on the other hand, is expected to self-report, and if we don't, we have someone there to go say, hey, you're screwing this up.
Yeah.
So it's just like, to me, that's what I talk about when I say I would like equal footing. Because if you gave us equal footing, there would be no other power industry would be up and running. Yeah. Like, literally, the guys that go and they climb up to do the wind turbine maintenance, they wouldn't do it because of, like, yeah, it's too hard trying to do this. I have to have a bag. I can't, I can't carry my equipment up here. My fall harness, I took it off, and now I got to go talk to someone about. They would just stop doing it. Mm-hmm. I mean, and by the way, wind is one of the deadlier forms of energy because literally people are falling off of those wind turbines and dying. Mm-hmm. We don't blame the wind industry for that, right? Even though the reason why that guy is up there is because the turbine needs maintenance, so he's up there, right? But if a guy falls and dies at a nuclear power station, oh no, it's a nuclear power station's fault, right? Yeah. So that's what I talk about with the equal footing, is that we're allowed to blame individuals that are not in the nuclear industry.
Right. On the idea of self-regulation, I remember you saying something along the lines of, like, nuclear companies have a lot of outsiders that they hire themselves to kind of, like, check. Am I?
You are right. Yeah. So I mean, it's not even really outsiders. So there's an organization called the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations. It's funded by the nuclear industry, and this is actually kind of interesting because it's called IMPO, is what everyone calls it. Yeah. And what they do is that they have a headquarters staff, and then they do audits, and give you an idea. These audits, like right now, the plant that I work at in my day job, we're on an 18-month audit. We're not talking like a week. It's 18 months they're evaluating us, right? So they're checking to see if we had a problem. How do we, were our actions effective in mitigating that in the future? So there's all sorts of aspects, between operations, between our engineering, between our maintenance, our records, everything gets audited. Now, INPO is funded by the industry, and the teams are made up of members of the industry, but they grade each reactor. So if I walk into let's say I walk into, we'll say Turkey Point, one of the two pressurized water reactors in there, you'll actually see there's a scorecard that has every pressurized water reactor in the United States with like these. It's a big chart with this big scale across it. Mm-hmm. Each reactor is actually separated based on the quartile they're in. So it's like days online, safety, right? All these different things they evaluate. Yeah. And then you're basically in competition with everyone. Mm. Every reactor is in competition with each other. And the INPO teams are made up of people from every company, right? So let's say that your INPO's down at an Exelon plant, right? Mm. They've got people from Next Energy, or from Entergy. You've got people from Dominion. They've got people from Southern. They've got people from, what is it? It's, PG&E, who own Diablo Canyon, right? They're down there, and they're grading them. Do you think they want to give that reactor a good score? Right. No, because it's going to drive their plants down, right? So that's where that competition comes from, is that, they've developed competition. I got to find all these issues. Mm-hmm. Right, so it's kind of a genius method in using the industry kind of against itself, yeah. And really, it's been super effective. and that the NRC has determined, I've got private people doing this. I don't see a need to do it for you, so they're scaling back some of their audits.
Right.
And their audits last about a week. So the government does a big audit, meaning they send in a team of 12, INPO sends in a team of 50 or 100, right? And who does INPO cost? It costs the companies, right? Who does the NRC cost? It costs you, the taxpayers.
Yeah.
So you, the taxpayers, get a crappy audit that's done over short periods of time with a small number of people. The utility is funding an audit to be done by a large team that's going to analyze the crap out of everything.
Yeah.
So that's where when I say self-regulation, and I will say this, that model has actually been used with oil drilling. So the oil drilling companies, basically after the Deepwater Horizon, they said, what's an industry that had their Deepwater? Oh wait, that's nuclear. With Three Mile Island. Three Mile Island was the inception of INPO. And so they walked up and they said, hey, you guys, with your accident back in 1979, figured this out. How can we figure it out, right? And so we can get, basically they said, we don't want an NRC for oil. We want to get out of that. How can we do that? And they said, well, this is the cheapest way, is to do it and do it ourselves.
That's really cool. But yeah, so I kind of wanted to ask you, I asked some people just that I'm friends with on social media some questions, and someone was interested in thorium reactors. Do you know anything about them?
Yeah. So when you talk about reactor fuels, there's three major types of fuel, right? You've got uranium-235, which is the current reactors. That's that thermal fuel I was talking about. Yeah. You've got plutonium, which is actually created from the uranium-238 that's also exists. Uranium-235 is 0.7% of all uranium. Uranium-238 is 99.3%. So we have, uranium, plutonium, but they're basically off the same material stream, if you will. Mm-hmm. And then thorium is just in the ground. I could walk out to the park and, pick a scoop of it. There's probably thorium in the dirt, right? Mm-hmm. Very, very abundant. And thorium now, it does require a seed, as it's called, to start it, because thorium is not nuclear fuel by itself. Much like that plutonium, it comes from something else. Well, thorium is the base. So thorium, you can actually convert it in a nuclear reactor. You can convert it into uranium-233, and then that's the fuel. But basically, all natural thorium is thorium-232. It's like 99.9, with like 100 nines after. There's a couple of other small trace amounts of other types of thorium, but it basically purely breeds into uranium-233. It's as difficult to make a weapon out of uranium-233 as it is plutonium out of a commercial reactor. So very difficult from that aspect as well. So hard for proliferation. So there are benefits to it. And when you actually consume all of your heavy elements, right? Your uraniums, your plutoniums, and anything basically uranium and above on the periodic table, your waste product stream at the end only lasts about 300 years. Because when we talk about that waste that lasts for 100,000 years or so, it's really, when you're talking about a commercial reactor, it's plutonium, because plutonium's half-life is about 24,000 years. If you didn't consume all of the uranium-233 in your reactor, uranium-233's half-life is about 150,000 years, which makes it somewhat, and we actually have a lot of uranium-233 waste from weapons programs early on at the, in the history of nuclear. But it's not, it's kind of weird because with like uranium-238, uranium-235, their half-lives are in the billions of years, which basically means it's extremely stable, so you can have large quantities of it, and you could even ingest it and it wouldn't hurt you because it's not producing enough radiation. But when you reduce that amount down to, say, 150,000 years, that's enough to where a small quantity of uranium can generate a lot. It's just basically concentrating the release of radiation.
Right.
It's a weird concept you have to think about, but and if you didn't mention thorium in this, you would probably get 8 million hate letters, because if you've been doing this as long as I have, literally I'll tweet something out there and I get literally as a response, thorium, right? It's kind of the super ultra pro nuclear response, whereas the anti-nuclear response is either Chernobyl or Fukushima. There's no context to it. Like they don't actually, a lot of times don't know what they're saying, which is fine. I'll give them the context to it. But, you have to talk, every time we talk nuclear, you have to be willing to talk about thorium. You have to be willing to talk about Chernobyl and Fukushima. Yeah. And we've talked about essentially Chernobyl and Fukushima. So you hit all three.
Right.
That's right.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, so regarding thorium then, with its abundancy and just the waste that it produces compared to uranium, is do people like it because I've heard that they're able to reuse the waste in certain cases?
So there's multiple aspects here so a lot of the thorium advocates basically, this is what's really weird, is that they think that because they're putting thorium in, that can then dump nuclear waste, the spent fuel from current reactors in there. If you do that, you're no longer you're a mixed blend fuel. But at that point, you're really more of a plutonium reactor.
Okay.
Right? So that's really because if you use a plutonium reactor, you can use the waste to make it into fuel. That fuel is plutonium. And you can use a blend of fuels. There's nothing that says you can't do that. In fact, the very first kind of commercial reactor was basically managed by the United States Navy. It was the very first commercial reactor designed for commercial operations, ran by a private company with oversight from the government up in Pennsylvania called Shippingport. She operated off of uranium-235, off of plutonium, and off of thorium. So you can use the same reactor, different types of fuel. We've done it way back in the 50s. Right? It's not like this isn't even new technology. Now, the waste that's left over from a plutonium or a thorium reactor are basically the same, right? So, it's going to last about 300 years, right? Now, when everyone talks about the waste and they hear plutonium or uranium, they're thinking about the current reactors. If you're using fast or thorium reactors, you're talking about ones that will consume 100% of the fuel, meaning your waste stream is 300 years, not 100,000 years.
Okay. And then another question I got, it's a kind of a funny one. It's he just says, what is the use of nuclear energy? And we kind of got to that earlier. He's like, I feel like when I hear about nuclear, I think of bombs. But can you speak to how long the fuel lasts and how long it could give us energy for, just in general?
It depends. It depends on the quality of fuel, the grade, how you load it out. So I'll give you an example. I'll give you multiple examples. All right, in a current commercial reactor, the fuel lasts about 4.5 years. We refuel them every 18 months, and like I said, we take a third of the fuel is removed because it's been in there for 3 cycles.
Yeah.
Right. So 3 cycles at 18 months is 4.5 years. Right. And some of them are on 2-year cycles, so it could be 6 years. Now, if you're looking at the United States Navy, for example, they use a different quality of fuel, and that submarine behind me, they call them throwaway cores because it operates for 33 years without refueling. And so now, and granted, these are all the old style reactors. Now, if you're using a reactor, say it's thorium or a fast reactor, it's generating its own fuel as it's operating. So remember, I loaded a bunch of thorium in there, and I got to have a seed to start it, and it starts building it. It generates neutrons. Those neutrons, in the process of making fission, some of those neutrons get absorbed by that thorium that becomes the uranium for your next fuel cycle, right? So it's basically self-generating its fuel. And you could easily design a reactor that could last for 20, 30, 40 years without actually needing to refuel. Or, especially when you're talking like a molten salt reactor, you could refuel them online. So you wouldn't, your fuel would basically, you might have to just inject a little fuel every now and again. So that's just kind of the fascinating thing. It's all how you load your fuel. You can load, I say it like this. If I were to take a commercial reactor, I can magically turn it into, say, a gas-cooled, a liquid metal, a molten salt reactor that used the exact fuel loadout that's in there, but operated as a fast instead of a thermal reactor. That reactor, instead of lasting 4.5 years with the fuel in there lasting 4.5 years, it would last somewhere around 400 years.
Wow.
Putting the same power out. So that's to kind of explain the inefficiencies of how we operate our reactors.
Yeah. And so that's
So,
the way that you would. I mean, is that the way that you would prefer to build a reactor or fuel it?
I mean, I would prefer that we could use a reactor that could consume 100% of the fuel. One is that I don't need that long term. When we're talking long term in nuclear, we're talking anything greater than 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, I would prefer not to have any long term waste, right? Which means I don't need Yucca Mountain, even though that's in the news as of last night,
Mm-hmm.
when the president's tweeting about Yucca Mountain and wanting to bring it back on there.
Yeah.
So the fact is that we've got Yucca Mountain. We could use Yucca Mountain to store it until we need it.
Mm-hmm.
And right now we actually have an abundance of fuel if we were to use waste. Right? I did a calculation. Just our nuclear waste itself, we probably have around 5,000 years of energy in the U.S. It's already mined just in the waste. That doesn't include the depleted uranium used to make their reactors, make the Navy's reactors, which is literally strapped to tanks as armor because it's thick and dense. It's used as rounds. So I could use that from the initial the purifying process of the fuel. So I have all that. Plus, I could use nuclear weapons. I could use and that waste I'm talking about in the spent nuclear fuel is just commercial. That 5,000 years just from commercial. There's waste left over from those. There's some that we could use there. There's our weapons. There's weapons waste. There's all sorts of stuff out there. We could even take smoke detectors and extract all, because most smoke detectors are actually, there's nuclear material in there that could be used as fuel.
Yeah.
And you have that in your house. So one of the things I always say is people say, well, nuclear is dangerous. So like, well, then take the smoke detectors out of your house and throw them away.
Yeah. Or and you mentioned you mentioned bananas this summer too. Yeah. Can you speak on that too? Just kind of the dangerous aspect, and I think after that I think we might be done. But can you kind of speak on those fears just in general?
Yeah. So everyone fears radiation, but they don't know. They're not educated on radiation. We have radiation around us all the time, right? And I call it the banana defense because bananas contain potassium, and most isotopes, almost all isotopes of potassium are radioactive, right? So you're eating a banana and you're actually eating radioactive material. Now it's low level radiation. It's not going to harm you, right? I mean, it's not large quantities or anything like that, but it's radioactive. The other thing that people talk about is because of Fukushima. Fukushima's the plant out there. They're going to release tons and tons of water, and the concern is this thing called tritium. Tritium, this tritium was generated in the reactors. It's the same as the tritium that's generated in the upper atmosphere that then rains down on us, right? So literally every glass of water you have, right, I'm going to consume some tritium in front of you, right? There's tritium in there. I mean, it's going to be a little higher concentration, but it's not enough to harm you.
Yeah.
And that's part of the thing that the public doesn't understand is that they want to black and white it. Radiation is bad. Well, no, radiation is not bad. It's a quantity of it. There's actually studies that say that a lack of radiation is probably just as bad as too much radiation. So it's finding that right balance, right? It's like, it's like anything. You don't want to eat just a diet of fat,
right,
but you do need some fat in it, right? You don't want to eat just a diet of protein, or there's that band you want in there.
Yeah.
And when you look, the average human gets somewhere between 150 and 500 milligrams of radiation per year. And I give the perspective, I did 20 years in the Navy, received 247 milligrams over 20 years from nuclear reactors. That's not a lot of radiation, right? Compare that to a CT scan. That's 1,000 milligrams in one shot.
Yeah.
And my daughter was really ill when she was a child. She's received 2 of those. That's almost 10 times the amount of radiation I received in 20 years from the Navy.
Wow.
And she received that as an infant, right? So that's the perspective that giving people is like, listen, we got to understand what we're talking about with all this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm educated on this, but I've also heard that people have concerns over just phones. Is there anything there?
Well, radiation, it comes in many forms. This is just it's a form of energy basically, and so there is some concern, and it's just you're literally putting a source of electromagnetic radiation, which is, would fall under visible light, infrared, gamma radiation, all that stuff. It's just depending different energy levels that you call it. And so you're putting that right up next to your ear. Is there a concern of that? There probably is. There will probably be some level of increased cancer in people's ears doesn't mean that it's going to be deadly. Doesn't mean that, it's going to kill everyone because of that. But people want to take these small things and blow them out of proportion.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the perspective that I was trained to when I first joined the Navy is if you took 10,000 people, 1,000 of them are going to die of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's just the average number, right? It's not right, wrong, or indifferent. That just is. If you took those same 10,000 people and you exposed them to 1,000 millirem of radiation throughout their lifetime, you might have 1,001 die of cancer. So, yeah, it sucks for that one person,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a contributing factor. It's not the only factor,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and even then, we don't even know if that's the cause.
Yeah.
I've received, since working at the commercial plant, I'm now close to, 500 millirem total my lifetime.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother me. It doesn't concern me,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I understand what I'm doing. I mean, I know guys that, worked in the industry early on that received, 2,500 millirem in a day,
Right.
right? Now it's like, that's a bad week and an outage
Mm-hmm.
for the whole station.
Yeah.
Right. So, we it's a difference in management. We've reduced the amount we find acceptable.
And then, I mean, because I think that could scare a lot of people, but I want to emphasize the idea. I mean, just because we're getting energy from these nuclear reactors doesn't mean that we're exposed to the radiation. The people working with them around the reactors will be, but they're willing to do it.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, we get radiation from the sun. We get, so I do want to kind of.
Yeah, and that's a great perspective. And we'll go back to an accident, right? So 3 Mile Island, big accident in the U.S. There was some exposure to the public. The people that lived immediately around the reactor site received about 3 millirem of radiation, or 3.2 millirem of radiation. If you go to the dentist, you get X-rays on your mouth, right? Typical thing, right? Checks your teeth.
Yeah.
Each one of those X-rays is 3 millirem.
Yeah.
Each one, right? You go to he may do 4 or 5. I've had a couple of root canals. It was like 15 X-rays to make sure you got everything cleaned out.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's a bad day of radiation for me at a power station. Right. 45. That's a lot. That's a lot in one day. 45 at a nuclear reactor as an operator.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But 15 X-rays at the dentist while I was doing a root canal, that's normal. And that guy literally the dentist was sitting in the room for most of them because he had to make sure he held it just right because he needed to look at one specific place. So, I mean, that's the perspective a lot of people don't have is that when they just hear radiation's bad. It's like, well, you're exposed to radiation all the time.
Yeah.
And just don't think about it. And what's the big fad in countertops for homes? It's granite. Mm-hmm. Granite's filled with radioactive materials.
Right.
You get more. Yeah, I probably get more radiation from my granite countertops than I do at work.
Yeah. Well, so kind of just to finish up, can you you kind of did a little bit earlier when we talked about the political aspect of it. Can you speak on like where you're at right now with the green nuclear deal, if anyone's hearing it, and then just tell people where they can find you and.
All right, so you can find me on my website. That's gen4nuclear.com, GENIVnuclear.com. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm at Schneider, SUB is in submarine. That's why I have the submarine behind me. And then Schneider, SCHNEIDER. You can actually also find me on CSAspeakers.com. I'm beginning my professional speaking career. So if any of your people want to book a speech with me, I'd greatly appreciate that. And as far as traction I'm receiving from the green nuclear deal, let's just say that I have both sides politically are reaching out to me. I'm talking with politicians on both sides of the aisle because I'll tell you, the Republicans, this is what I'm seeing, the Republicans are about to take climate change as an issue from the Democrats, and the Democrats know this, and they are terrified because the Democrats know that the Democrats that are pro-nuclear know it's going to work, and they know that the Republicans are going to be a monolith with it, and they are literally scrambling in fear to get the wind and solar and the boutique environmentalists going, no, you need to get behind nuclear, or we're going to lose this, and we're going to lose all control of the government because the party that can explain nuclear and explain how it's going to fix climate change is going to slaughter in 2020.
Yeah. Right.
So.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, it was great talking to you again, and
Awesome.
we'll do this again sometime.
Hey everyone, if you made it to the end of this podcast, let me know what you think. You can reach out to me if you have any more questions regarding nuclear energy. I might be able to answer them, or I can just get a hold of Mark and ask for you, or you can get in touch with him as well. But yeah, something that I also forgot to mention is to create another show within the Liam McCullum Show, where I review movies with my friends. May even just have political discussions with my friends. Just rant. I don't know. I really still don't know where this is going other than what I already mentioned. I do want to continue interviews. I think that they're really fun. I hope you guys do too. But yeah, let me know what you think, and come back soon. Thank you.